attention. I'm Betsy Neely, and I'm a board member for C, and I'm honored to introduce Alex Cook, our speaker this morning. She is currently the refuge manager for the Bandon Marsh National Wildlife Refuge with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I can speak for the board in saying that we really enjoyed working with Alex. Before she started position as the refuge manager in summer of 2022, she was in graduate school in New York studying salt marsh and seaside sparrows in the marshes of New York City. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, the urban
sparrow behind JFK Airport.
She has worked with a variety of bird species, including snowy plovers, piping plovers, Arctic nesting, shorebirds, and warblers. She grew up on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and has always enjoyed, loved coastal environment. And today her presentation will focus on the birds of the Oregon coast. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Steve, for having me, and thanks everyone for coming out on this beautiful day. Hopefully, after this, you'll run outside and look at birds. Let's see. How do I change the slides? Oh no, really?
Use an arrow.
I thought that's what I did. Okay, there we go. All right. So like Betsy said, I'm the refuge manager here in Bandon at Bandon Marsh. I grew up in coastal Massachusetts, and so I feel like Bandon is like the Cape Cod of Oregon. And so we've got cranberries, we got beaches, we got tourists. So I feel very at home here. And I've worked with a variety of bird species, mostly shorebirds and seabirds. Here's my JFK Airport shot. So we were studying the sparrows that were nesting in the marshes behind the airport. So yeah, been all over the country studying different birds, but today I will talk about the birds of Oregon. So I kind of broke it down into a few different groups, but as you see, all water bird based, all coastal birds. So we'll talk about seabirds, marsh birds, and then some shorebirds. So here in Bandon specifically, we are super lucky that we have a lot of seabird colonies really close to us that we can view off of Coquille Point. And we're going to talk about a couple different of the birds you might see out there. So a lot of the bird species that we have nesting on the rocks are called alcids. That's a family of birds, and they're all characterized by having these webbed feet, short, stiff wings. So they're actually pelagic species, which means they spend all of their time out in the ocean, and the only time they come to land is, or come to land is to nest on the rocks. So they're not feeding on shore, they're not doing anything on land except when they're breeding, and they're on the rocks for that purpose. So they actually are almost better underwater swimmers than they are flyers. So that's why their wings are really short and stiff to help them swim underwater to catch fish. Most of these species are monomorphic, which means the males and females look exactly the same. So you can't tell whether you're looking at a male or a female in a pair. And a lot of them are colony nesters. So one of our most abundant species is the common murre. Heard reports this morning they're back out on the rocks here at Coquille Point, so that's really exciting to have them back. We have a pretty large population here in Oregon, so there's about 500,000 birds that nest off the rocks here in Oregon. They're pretty long-lived species, so they live 25 years. A lot of these seabirds are pretty long-lived compared to, say, like the sparrows I was studying. They're lucky if they live 5-7 years. So these larger birds tend to live longer. Murres specifically have a high breeding site fidelity. So a lot of the birds that you see in Bandon are the same birds that were here the year before, or maybe they were chicks here and they come back to their rocks, especially if they're successful. You know, if birds are successful at one site, they often return to the site again. They are monogamous. So, you know, once they have a pair, they stay with it. I don't know if they do every year. That's a good question. But within a season, they stay with their mate. And there's usually pretty equal sex ratios, and they nest on the tops of the rocks or on ledges. So we'll talk about other seabirds who nest in burrows or crevices or things like that. So all these seabirds have kind of found a way to divide up the different habitats of the rocks. And so the murres, we know we see them on the top a lot. They lay some really beautiful eggs. They're kind of known for these light blue and teal speckled eggs. So sometimes if you're lucky, you might find an egg washed up on the beach, and it's really cool. And you know it's a mer from that really blue color. They're really synchronous in their breeding strategies. So they, when they all have eggs at the same time, and then all their chicks will hatch at the same time. And I assume it's kind of like a safety in numbers thing. If we're all doing the same thing at the same time, we're all sitting on our eggs, we're all feeding our chicks, things like that. And they only lay one egg. So a lot of these large-bodied birds only lay one egg. So that's literally putting all your eggs in one basket. You got one egg, you got one chance. So there's a lot to lose when a predator comes and takes your one egg. That was a lot of energy, or your chick gets predated by a raven or something. You've lost a big investment. And it takes about 32 days for the egg to grow into a chick. So that's another pretty long incubation period compared to some other bird species we'll talk about. Like we said, they're really good swimmers. They can dive up to 300 feet searching for fish, and then they feed their chicks their fish. And what's cool about the common mers is that once the chicks are large enough and fledge, the males will actually jump off the rocks into the sunset with their chicks and spend a month or two out at sea together, teaching their chick how to fish, where to fish, things like that. I know a lot of people who take their boats out fishing into the ocean, you kind of see that dad and chick pair out together all the time, and I think it's really cute. Another favorite species that we are very lucky that we get to see pretty regularly here in Bandon is the tufted puffin. At Face Rock, you go out in the summertime, Sea will be there with their scopes and they will show you a tufted puffin. So that's, hopefully we have good views of them this year. They're, a really charismatic species. They're only on the West Coast here, and they nest all the way up into Alaska, as well as down into California. So here in Southern Oregon, we're on kind of the southern extent of their range. And we are seeing declines in the southern portions of the population. But as far as we know, up in Alaska, there's still pretty good numbers. So unlike the common murre, which nests on the top of the rocks, puffins are burrow nesters. So they have these big feet and claws and big strong bills that lets them literally dig into the kind of, hard soil pack that is on some of the offshore rocks. Or, like at Face Rock, it seems like they take advantage of a lot of the natural crevices that are already in the rocks. So they're burrow nesters, and their burrows can be quite long. So the average depth is 33 inches, but you'll see in some other slides, we did some burrow surveys down at some rocks south of here. I could stick my whole arm in that burrow and I didn't even touch the back. So they can dig pretty far, and they make a cozy little spot for their single egg that they lay. So again, a lot of investment in one egg. They are also ultimate fishermen. That bill can hold a lot of fish. People have done, food provisioning studies where they study the puffins and they see how many fish they're bringing back. They try to identify what species of fish. And so one study found that the average beakful was 10 fish, which is, I think, a lot of fish. And apparently the record was 60 fish. And so how do they do that? Well, they evolved to be able to hold a lot of fish in their bill because they have this kind of hinged jaw situation that lets them open their mouth really wide. And then they also have something, a lot of seabirds have these called denticles, kind of like little Velcro on the top of their roof of their mouth that holds the fish in and stops them from slipping out while they're, so they have to be able to hold a fish in their mouth while they're also catching another fish at the same time. So pretty cool to see how all these things have evolved and made them so successful in this marine environment. So because puffins are burrow nesters, and because they are declining here on the Southern Oregon coast, we at the Wildlife Refuge, so the Oregon Coast National Wildlife Refuge Complex, are kind of experimenting into different ways we can maybe help them. So other sites in the Northeast have had success with these burrow boxes. So we've created a variety of different designs. Our volunteers here in Bandon, Gary and Julie, if you guys know them, they built all these boxes. They were doing this. It was amazing. So we have a couple different designs. The idea is that, you know, habitat is declining and vegetation is changing, and maybe burrow availability could be limiting their success. So we're going to test out these boxes this summer. We've got wooden ones, we've got culvert-based ones. These are drain covers with culverts attached to it. We're testing out black and white because we're afraid that the black boxes might get too hot. You know, if they're sitting in the sun, even though the coast is pretty cool in temperature, but if you're in direct sun all day. So it's an experiment. We also have some decoys that we've ordered from the East Coast. That's another successful way to attract birds to come to a site. A decoy. Yeah, so it's kind of like a little, I think this one's a rhinoceros auklet there. And we are also going to put out something called an eye button, which is records temperature. So we can see how hot the boxes are getting and whether or not it would be suitable for birds. And then we'll see if a bird uses them. So, you know, when you're talking about the conservation of a species, you want to plan ahead and see what tools you might have in your toolbox. And so these are not going to save tufted puffins, but if they can help a few and maybe birds use them, we'll see. So maybe next year we'll report back. We will put them on hopefully Goat Island, which is down south, outside of Goat Island, outside of Brookings. And then there's another island up north that we're going to try. So not all the offshore rocks are accessible to humans. Like you can't scale the cliffs of Elephant Rock to get up there, but there are some other islands that have more vegetation on them that are easier to climb. Do you have a question?
Yes. Very part of it.
No, we didn't bury them. That's another thing is we don't want them to blow away. So we're still also trying to figure out how to get them to stay. Like these ones with the wood are really heavy. These ones are a little bit lighter. So we'll have to see, maybe we stake them or maybe we put something on top, but you kind of try to nestle them in the vegetation. So we're not burying them per se, but maybe concealing them a little bit. And so one of the species that we're hoping will use these boxes is the rhinoceros auklet. They're closely related to puffins, and they have similar habits. They are burrow nesters, and they are on the offshore islands. And so both puffins and rhino auklets are not quite as colonial as like the murres and things, but they still tend to group up together. So you'll see that in the next slides. And then one fact I read about them is that they're mostly active during dawn and dusk and nocturnal hours. And people were saying that they wonder if that evolved so that they could avoid interactions with gulls. So gulls love to steal fish. And so if you're bringing fish back to your chicks while the gulls are sleeping, you might have a better chance of actually feeding your chick that fish. And you can see the rhino auklets have a much wider range than tufted puffins. So they nest over into Asia, in Japan, along the Aleutian Islands and things like that. So pretty cool that we have them here in Oregon too.
No.
Mm-hmm. They are they here in Bandon? I don't know the answer to that question. I know they are further south. Oh, okay, in the ocean they see them, yeah, but I don't know where they nest on these islands or not. And then no one really knows why they have this funky protrusion. They follow the same trend in which the males and females look the same. So usually when something kind of seemingly random to us humans evolves, it's because, you know, the males want to attract the female or something. But in this situation, both males and females have them. So just a cool little horn they have. So we do have rhinoceros auklets on Hunter's Island, which is down south in Curry County, and that is one of the islands that you can access. So last year, well, back up to 2021, the Refuge contracted some aerial surveys to look at invasive plants on all the offshore islands. So basically a helicopter flew over the islands and took close-up pictures of the islands, and then using GIS and photo software, we're able to identify the plant species on the islands and which were native, which were non-native. And so Hunter's Island was identified by having a lot of New Zealand spinach in a lot of the areas where the birds nest. And so we're wondering if the invasive plant could be impacting the burrow habitat suitability. So if we're going to try to study that, we need to start with a baseline. And so we need to figure out how many birds are there right now. So we went out at the end of the breeding season. We didn't want to do this when the birds were in their nests. We didn't want to disturb them. So we went out at the end, I think it was in September, maybe. We went out onto the island and we stuck our arms in all the burrows we could find. And we tried to, measure how long they were. But a lot of times I couldn't even touch. I could try to wrap my arm, or like I stuck my whole arm in there. So that was cool to see how far they burrowed. We tried to look for evidence of activity. So did it look like the dirt was freshly used? Was there bird poop that looked recent? So maybe they were using it that year. Did we find any eggshell fragments, things like that? So we tried to characterize whether the burrows were active that year. We counted them. We had a really high precise GPS contraption that let us mark each burrow. So you can see here, each yellow dot is a burrow that we recorded. And there were 249 rhinoceros auklet burrows, and there were a handful of tufted puffins in there too. We kind of used the diameter of the hole, whether or not it was a rhino auklet or a puffin. And some of the puffin burrows, they were big. I mean, bigger than I expected. So that was really cool to get on the ground on the islands. And that was just our first step. So we're hoping this year to maybe treat some of those invasive plants out there. And then as we long-term make a dent on those invasive plants, we'll see, are we finding more burrows? Or is there more success? Things like that. So just a pilot study last year, but we're hoping to do more this year. Like the same burrows every time? I don't know. That would be cool to know, but I'm not sure. I don't know if people know that. I don't know.
And also, I think in the grass
Mm-hmm.
is that for nesting material, or do they actually?
I don't think they eat it. A lot of birds do kind of line their nests with things, sticks, grass, to make it softer. So I would guess that's why, but I'm not an expert on any one of these birds. So there's a lot of, detailed life history things that I don't know off the top of my head, but I would guess to line their nest.
You've actually seen them do it.
Okay. Yeah. A lot of you here have more years of experience than I do. So shout it out. Oh, the bird digs them. Yes. 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 For the ones that are in the dirt, the bird is digging. They may find a naturally occurring like crevice, in the rocks, but yeah, these ones in specifically, I mean, this is a, kind of a mounded hill of grass, and the birds dug in the dirt. Mm-hmm. Things. Another species we have here is the pigeon guillemot. They are very easy to identify by their bright red feet and their white wing patches. They're also a pretty small bird compared to some of those larger species. And they will be on the rocky shorelines. They don't nest in huge colonies like the murs, but they will sometimes group up together. And they're considered crevice nesters. So they don't necessarily dig their own burrows, but they do want to find kind of hidden spots. And they'll lay 1 to 2 eggs. One study found that parents will deliver an average of 1 fish per hour. So they are busy out there fishing, trying to feed their chicks. And these chicks grow really fast and get really large. So they found that they could weigh double their weight in 5 days and triple their weight in 10 days. So they go from a fluff ball like that to a big begging baby over there. And part of why the chicks have to get so chunky and large with pigeon guillemots as opposed to, say, a common murre is because once the chick leaves the nest, it's totally alone. So it doesn't get dad to help it, teach it how to fish, find its way. It's got to be big and strong enough on its own to fend for itself.
Mm-hmm. With the pigeon guillemot, we've seen them over in Charleston, Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and really interesting thing about them is when you open their mouth, their entire inside of their mouth is red. It's so cool.
Yeah, the red mouth and the red legs, they're just, they really pop. Okay, cormorants. We also have those here in Bandon, and we have a couple different species, which are all quite beautiful when you really look at them closely. Cormorants have really kind of long, thin bills, webbed feet. They also eat fish exclusively. And unlike seabirds that use their wings really to power themselves swimming underwater, they use their feet more. So their wings are not quite as pointed and, plane-like as a lot of the seabirds. And they nest in colonies on the shores, on cliffs. Maybe you'll see them on pilings, on bridges, things like that. So they're a little less specific than some of these other seabirds. The pelagic cormorant is one species we have here. When you see these white flanks, it's pretty certain that that's the species you're looking at. So that helps with ID. And their name as a pelagic cormorant is a little bit of a misnomer because they do spend time on land and they're not out at sea like the other seabirds are. They grab their fish in their bill, but some people think that with such a narrow bill, they're spearing the fish, but none of those birds do that, although that would be cool too. And they're another long-lived species, 18 years. All these larger bodied birds live much longer than small songbirds. They kind of nest on ledges and will gather nesting materials like grass or sticks, things like that you might see in the rack line. And they can lay up to 8 eggs, but usually around 4. So they have more chicks. And they will actually use their own guano to kind of cement their nest onto the rock faces. So you can see that here in Bandon. It's pretty smart tactic. Mm-hmm.
They also nest under the bridge in Charleston.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they like pilings and things like that. Mm-hmm. We also have Brandt's cormorants, which are really cool. They have that blue under their bill, and they're kind of blue in color. I remember Brandt's blue. That's how I remember which species I'm looking at. And they have some really cool mating displays and are kind of more sociable birds. And their fun fact is that they have a large volume of blood compared to their total body weight. So they're really good at holding oxygen in their systems. And I'd imagine that's probably true for most of these seabirds that need to hold their breath for a long time underwater. They've evolved to be able to have high volumes of blood so that they can dive longer and deeper. Western gulls are another species that I think we're actually pretty lucky to have here in Bandon. I know they just look like a seagull, but they are, rather large, easy to identify. They hang out on the beach. They're comfortable around people, but they can live up to 30 years. So you could be looking at a gull and it could be as old as your grandkid. And, it's seen things in this world. And gulls can be tricky to identify because they have a lot of different plumage variations, their first summer versus their second summer. And I don't even try. That's too much for me. I'm not that hardcore of a birder, but you can tell how old a gull is sometimes by looking at its plumage. So this guy, he's got something going on, but he will grow into a full plumaged adult someday. And they're actually one of the least common gulls in North America. So you can see they have a really restricted range to just the coast of the Western United States. So they're not inland at all. And there's only about 4,000 pairs, so 80,000 birds over that entire range. So it's a species I'd never seen before until I moved here to Oregon. Western gull. 40,000. Did I say 4,000? Sorry. They are also colonial nesters. So you'll see they've been hanging out on Elephant Rock for a while now, but they'll be up there starting to build their nests and mating up soon. They usually lay 3 eggs, and they find a spot. They're mostly surface nesters, but they will build some vegetation and kind of a little stick nest. And gulls can be really antagonistic to each other. They're very territorial, but they also can be very antagonistic to other species. So they're always trying to steal fish. The scientific word is kleptoparasitism. So they're parasites who steal from other fish, other birds. But they all play their role in the ecosystem, and they are very cute. They're chicks when you see them bobbling around up there. So some threats to seabirds, we're all here because we care about birds. So things that can impact their success are things like fireworks, drones, leaving lights on, big buildings with big lights, things like that. Predators, of course, so crows, ravens, bald eagles, those are a lot of the ones we see here. And then species like mink or raccoons, otters, other mammalian species that we don't get to see as much, but they get out on the islands. And we actually have an OSU grad student who has cameras out on some of the offshore islands, and he's recorded mink, raccoons, river otters on the islands, as well as mink predating Leach's storm petrels. So there are other mammals out there that are also a threat. And then, of course, there's the bigger issue of food distributions and fish abundance and how climate change is impacting the ocean. And that's probably one of the biggest threats to seabirds and one of the hardest things for us as a little wildlife refuge to fix. So just something to keep in mind. What sea creature? I don't know. Do you guys think seals would like eat birds sitting on the water? I don't know if they have many predators out in the ocean. Steve's shaking his head, so.
We've seen peregrines catch some of the small birds.
Yeah, but that's not a sea creature.
No.
I don't know. I don't think so, but that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. All right, on to tidal marsh birds. So here in Bandon, we have the Refuge. Major restoration project happened at the Nyleston unit back in 2009 to 11. Many of you are probably here. So the restoration has really been a great success. We've got salt marsh plants coming back, a lot of birds and animals coming back. The Refuge has contracted OSU and other researchers to test things like elevation, salinity, sediment flow, things like that. And all of that is on track and moving forwards now that it's been a little over 10 years. So that's really exciting that the Refuge is seeing, kind of the natural ecological processes coming back. Tidal marsh systems are really high in energy and they have a lot of food resources. They are really dynamic because they have that tide coming in and going out twice a day. So a lot of the species that live in those systems had to evolve to this really dynamic system. And it may be really dynamic with a lot of food, but it's really homogeneous. So there's no trees that you can hide under or things like that. It's just all very similar vegetation. So a lot of these birds have to be pretty secretive and good at concealing their activities because they don't have a thicket to run into. Like you might see the sparrows, they run into a bush. Well, these guys, there's no bushes. Where are they going?
What happened to the marsh that it needed to be restored?
Oh, sure. I should have given more background. The marsh was, it was a marsh, and then it was converted to a dairy farm for agriculture. So a lot of the river on the Coquille is farmed for farming. So there was about 1.5 miles of a levee on, I think, this side of the marsh that came down. And then there were a lot of, you see ditches and channels and things. So basically, the farmers like to prevent the salt water from flowing over into the marsh because cows don't want to eat salty grass. They want to eat fresh grass. So when the Refuge, the landowner sold the parcel to the Refuge, it took a few years of planning, but they took down that 1.5 mile of levee. They reconnected the channels. They elevated a road. They dug power lines under the marsh. It was a whole ordeal. So now the marsh has been restored. Where was that? Marsh wrens. One of the more common species you'll see if you go for that walk down the short trail we have into the marsh is the marsh wren. They're really vocal. It's probably the bird you're hearing. They kind of make a really twittery long call. And they have an interesting mating strategy in which one male will mate with multiple females. So the male will be the father to multiple nests. And they build these kind of hanging grass cavities using the marsh grasses, and the male will build multiple nests and the female will pick which one she likes the best. And they lay 4 to 6 eggs, so much more than that one egg. And one of the biggest differences you'll see is they only incubate for 13 days. So the myrrh incubated for 32. Yeah. So that's a lot of energy, a lot of time, but you end up with a big chick that can go fly off at sea. These guys, they only take 13 days for their chicks to hatch. And the chicks are altricial, which means they can't feed themselves. They can't fly. They can't really do anything. They're just kind of like little dinosaurs sitting in a nest until they get big enough. But the reason why these birds have to incubate so quickly and then in another 13 days their chicks can fly is because of the tide cycles. So you'll see, we have monthly tides. So there's a highest tide of the month, and then there's a slightly lower high tide in that month, and then in between we have the low tides. And so those intervals are about 13 days. And so the chicks need to grow really fast so that when the highest high tide comes, they're able to climb out of the nest and get away from those incoming waters. So really all these birds that have evolved in marsh ecosystems are just driven by the tides and that cycle. So that's why we see such fast incubation and such fast growth periods in marsh birds.
So they all get born around the same time at a low tide?
It often happens that way. The way we think it happens, we can't ask the birds, is a lot of birds, they start, they lay their nests. So we don't think that birds can like sense the tides or anything, but they might pick the time. All right, it's feeling spring-like, I'm going to lay my nest. And then, oh shoot, it was actually high tide in 2 days. So that knocked them all out. Now they're all reset. And so now they're all reset on that cycle. So we think that the first high tide that floods them is what gets them on the right track. So often it is everyone's on the same speed but that's just our guess. Marsh wrens, for whatever reason, peck and destroy the eggs and young of other species. So they are common predators. So those sparrows I studied in New York, the marsh wrens were often predators of those sparrow nests. And interestingly, I'm not sure why that evolved, but things like that happen. And so marsh wrens have eggs that are almost 3 times stronger than similarly sized other songbird eggs. And it's because they are protecting themselves from each other. So it's kind of cool how things like that, one thing happens and then, evolution responds and it makes cool sense. Another species that you'll see pretty often, almost every time you're out at the marsh, is a northern harrier. A lot of people call them marsh hawks. That's what I was raised to call them. And they have a really cool, very light flight over the marsh, and they hold their wings kind of in a V. But you can see they're distributed all across the country. So maybe just because I grew up in a coastal spot, we call them marsh hawks. Maybe in Oklahoma, you call them something else. But they have a cool sexual dimorphism, which means that the males and females look different. So the females are brown and larger, and the males are gray and smaller. And then the juveniles have that brown plumage until they grow into either their male or female plumage. And they have a really distinct white rump. So if you are looking at a bird soaring over the marsh and you see that white rump, it's pretty much telltale sign you're looking at a northern harrier. And they also have these unique face discs like owls have. So most hawks don't have those discs, and it's because they hunt similarly to owls in that they're flying low and they're using that hearing to locate prey, mostly small mammals in marshes or grasslands. But what I didn't know about them until I started looking into things for this PowerPoint was that they're actually ground nesters and will nest sometimes in small colonies. Or, oh no, they roost in colonies, but they'll nest on the ground. So here's a picture of a nest kind of in the reeds in either, the edge of a marsh or a grassland. And they can be as big as 2 feet wide, the nesting site that they have. They lay 4 to 5 eggs and they feed primarily on rodents. So for all these birds of prey, they're really susceptible to poisons that people might use to kill rodents. And then they eat the rodent and they're passing on those chemicals to their chicks. Another species we have at the marsh are white-tailed kites, which I think are super cool. I'd never seen them before until I moved here. And then this winter, I saw them almost every day. They're kind of fading out now. We might have them through the summer, but at one point I had 3 at the refuge at once. And they have a very interesting range. You can see we have them in Oregon and they're pretty common in California. And then I don't know what the reason is behind all this. It seems like maybe they like forested areas. I don't know, but I thought that was interesting distribution throughout the globe. And what makes kites a kite is this behavior called kiting, in which they hover. You'll see them flapping their wings high above the marsh. And then when they locate a prey, they swoop down with their feet out first, and hopefully catch the small mammal they were trying to get. So that you'll see that over the marsh, the birds flying high, waiting to dive down. And they're not as territorial as a lot of other raptors. Like I said, there were 3 birds at once all hunting together on the refuge this year. And unlike the harriers, they actually do build stick nests up in trees. So I'm going to try to see if we have a nest on the refuge. I don't know if we do, but we had a lot of kites, so we'll see. Another common species in marshes throughout the country is the Virginia rail. So they can be found in freshwater or brackish wetlands. So we still have them at the refuge, but they're not pure saltwater species. And rails are often referred to as secretive marsh birds. Things like rails, soras, they stay low. They don't fly very often. They can be really hard to see, but they're very territorial. So sometimes if you are out in a wetland, a Virginia rail will come up to you as a human and start clacking at you and be like, get out of my spot. My babies are here. So they're kind of funny birds with big personalities. They weave nesting platforms. So they lay about 13 eggs. So they have to make a nest big enough for that. And they'll take reeds and grasses and things like that to kind of build a platform for them to lay their eggs on. And they'll even build ramps for themselves to walk up to get to their nest. So all these birds that nest in the marsh, they don't want to put it right on the ground because they're going to get flooded. So they have to build it high enough off the ground using the structure of the living vegetation to place their nests high enough that the tides won't get it. And you can see that female has a lot of eggs under there to incubate. Well, they don't have to feed them. You'll see next. But yes, all the eggs should in theory be viable. And with a lot of these birds, so birds that have precocial chicks, meaning the chicks can get up and walk, they actually will not start incubating all their eggs until, like, they won't start incubating them full time until they've laid them all. So they might be able to lay an egg every day. And if the weather's cool and it's not too sunny, they might leave that egg all day while they're feeding and that kind of stuff. Then they lay another egg and another egg. And then once they've laid all their eggs, then they sit on those eggs constantly. And by not fully incubating until you've got everyone, they're all developing kind of on the same timeline. So that's something that these precocial species have evolved. And so these birds, once the chicks hatch, they're little fluff balls. They've got almost not quite full-size legs, but they've got big legs, and they can walk around and feed themselves. So they all kind of travel like quails. If you see quails, they get up and they're running and moving, and you see that family moving around together. They're feeding themselves. So I've not seen any chicks here in this marsh, but in my other marsh work I have, and they're very cute. And rails have some of the highest leg muscle to flight muscle ratio because they spend more time running than they do flying. So these birds have big legs, they run around the marsh, they stay low, and that's how they evade predation. So some of the threats to, they're mostly just eating invertebrates. So little worms, little shrimp, whatever kind of wetland mud insects they can find, maybe some vegetation, but mostly invertebrates. So, sea level rise is a threat to all of us, especially marshes. It can affect the elevation of the marshes. Changes in tidal flooding and intensity can make it harder for those birds to succeed. If a big storm comes and makes the tide higher than it was supposed to be, then that might wash away their nest, when if that storm didn't come, they would have had 4 more days before the highest tide hit. So things like that can cause the birds to fail, and then it can also just change the sediment flow and the vegetation composition of marshes. Invasive species can be a problem. I know in California they have a big problem with Spartina alterniflora changing vegetation and crowding out on mudflats. And then of course human development. So a lot of times when people talk about marshes, they're basically being pinched on both ends. We have human development coming in from the uplands, and then we have sea level rise coming in from the water. And so where are marshes supposed to go? So that's one of the things that are threatening a lot of these habitats. The last group of species I'll talk about are shorebirds. You can see we have a variety of species. Pretty much all the birds that we see here in Oregon are just migrating through. So a lot of these species nest up in the Arctic, and then they overwinter down in Central and South America. And Oregon is just a stopping point on the way. So if you go out to Riverside Drive at the Bandon Marsh overlook, we have a nice big mud flat there. And if you go, probably it's end of April, early May, we'll see the shorebirds. They'll be coming up from their wintering grounds, and they're heading up north to their breeding grounds. So having a place where they can rest and fuel up and not be disturbed is really critical to their success. One of the most common species we see out there is the western sandpiper. They have a pretty wide range. You see them on the East Coast and the West Coast, but all of their breeding happens up in the Arctic and in Alaska. And they get this kind of rusty color as they're getting into their breeding plumage, and they have really short bills, and they're also, probing the marsh or the mud flats for mostly invertebrates, so little insects and things like that. They can migrate over 6,000 miles, and they only weigh about 25 grams, which is the weight of a AA battery. So when you think about what humans can do, we can only what? Maybe we can run a marathon sometimes, but this guy, 6,000 miles.
What's the advantage of going to the tundra?
Yeah, a lot of food. There's a lot of resources up there. So during the summer in Alaska, which I did get to be a part of one season, which was really cool. There's a lot of food. There's open ground, so you don't have trees or things in the way. I'm not 100% sure why it does seem like quite the flight, but there's a lot of species that do that migration. And there's a lot of insect hatching and resources up there, when the snow melts. So that's what all these species do. They go back and forth between the two sites. And, there's less people up there. So
It's true about the mosquitoes.
yes, you can attest. This is, a pretty large population of species. There's maybe over 3.5 million at one point. Who knows what it is exactly now from when that stat was taken, but you'll see large flocks on the Oregon coast migrating through. Another common species that can be confused with the western sandpiper, because we do have both here, is the least sandpiper. And the easiest way to tell the difference, if you can get close enough, is that western sandpipers have black legs and least sandpipers have yellow legs. And least sandpipers are tinier, but when they're far away, it's hard to tell. Another species you'll see out at Riverside Drive is the black-bellied plover. They are distributed globally, so you can see them all throughout the earth, but we're lucky that we have them here. And so in their breeding plumage, this is their full-on dapper look. You often see them in some formation of this. Either they're losing their black belly or they're gaining their black belly. So they won't always look quite like that, but similarly with the white head and the black patches is where we will see them. And they are tundra nesters. And what I think is really cute about them is that their chicks are speckled in a way to camouflage with the lichen that they're nesting in. So the tundra is really full of lichen and short growing grasses, and they use camouflage as their defense. And these birds, just like I was talking about with the rails, have synchronous hatching. So once all 4 eggs are laid, the adults will start incubating, and then when the chicks hatch, they'll all leave together as a family. And so this might be what the birds look like when you see them in Oregon. They might be juveniles that have kind of this really mottled look to them, or they're losing their plumage. But a way to always tell a black-bellied plover is a black-bellied plover is by this black armpit. So they'll always have this armpit if you see them fly. And that's how you can distinguish it from a golden plover, which is another similarly looking species, not quite as common, but golden plovers don't have the black armpit. And threats to shorebirds, Similar, I mean, climate change is a threat to all of them, but especially birds that nest in the Arctic, climate change is impacting the poles of the globe at stronger rates than we're feeling here in the equator. So that warming is changing the timing of things like when the mosquitoes hatch. And so if the mosquitoes hatch before the chicks are hatched, then the chicks don't get to eat the mosquitoes and there's not as much of a food source. So a lot of these things are timed really cyclically, and if climate change is altering these cycles, it's going to be harder for things to succeed. Here in Oregon, human disturbance. So when birds are resting because they need to fly another 1,000 miles and a dog chases them, well, that's wasting energy that they could be saving, that they need to fuel up on for the next leg of their journey. So disturbance is a problem. And then predation, up in Alaska, in theory, things should be balanced. And, there are foxes and Jaegers and things, but it's somewhat less impacted by humans. But, we know here in Oregon with snowy plovers, things like ravens, crows, foxes can have a big impact on shorebirds. And that was my last one. I can take any questions. Nancy?
So is it to create a new colony of like birds like birds, which are Florida, and have this, the sunnies out around. I've been following the difficulties with sea otters.
Oh.
And the large males.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was in the right time of island, and yeah, this looks like home.
Yeah. They don't, they don't, it's get, we could just talk to the birds, tell them it's a good spot. It's possible though. I don't know if you guys have heard about Project Puffin up in Maine. So a lot of the things that we're trying down here, we're stealing from Maine. And so a researcher named Steve Kress in the 80s dedicated his life to restoring Atlantic puffins to the coast of Maine. And he had boxes and decoys and transplanted 15 birds or something. And I should read up on it more so that I know the exact facts, but it took years to get the birds to come back and have enough animals that, stayed and then attracted more. But now they have full-fledged colonies. So, it was the 80s and now it's the 2024. So it took decades, but it is possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, the birds that we receive lose that egg, do they try again?
A lot of times they will try again until it gets too late in the season that they wouldn't succeed. If they have to go back to the shore and the timing of things are off. So much of this is about timing. But yeah, they will try again sometimes.
Thank you for
All right.
presentation.